So for those of you who do not know me, my name is Courtney Montgomery. I am the outreach lead here at the Mount Royal University of Library. And today I am in Mohkinstsis, which is otherwise known as the city of Calgary. And Mount Royal University is situated on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, as well as the Stoney Nakoda and the Tsuut'ina First Nations. And as a Métis settler, I am grateful to make my home here in Calgary, and I recognize my responsibility to honor and give back to these nations. And today we're here for Collections and Conversations, which is a series that has been running throughout the year. We have Dr. Marty Clark and Dr. Andrea Phillipson. I'm just going to do a quick intro and then I will turn things over to them. So Dr. Marty Clark teaches in the Department of Health and Physical Education and has a passion for inclusivity, equity, and social justice in university education. His courses ask students to examine health, physical activity, and sport from historical, philosophical, and sociological perspectives. And Dr. Andrea Phillipson has an eclectic academic background with degrees in fields as diverse as literary studies and sociocultural studies of sport, health, and the body. After completing a postdoctoral fellowship in educational development, Andrea joined the faculty team at the Academic Development Center here at MRU in 2018. She also teaches at the Department of Health and Physical Education. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Marty and Andrea.
Thanks, Courtney. Yeah, thank you very much, Courtney, for the introduction and the land acknowledgement to get us started, as well as for facilitating these collections and conversations talks. Andrea and I are very excited and happy to be here today to talk with everyone about our talk, which is titled Stampede, a Colonial History of Sports in the MRU Archives. And just a quick thank you to M. Medlin Martian as well, who took the picture of me that you see there. Thank you for setting that up. I didn't have any pictures, so I needed to get a picture taken. And as well, thank you to everyone who worked on the collections and conversations talks, and a special thanks to Peter Houston, the archivist in the archives and special collections here at Mount Royal University, who we'll talk about in 1 second. So we also were planning on giving a land acknowledgement today, and I just want to pause here for a second to thank Courtney for the land acknowledgement to get us started, and to just sort of just kind of place importance on something that we're going to talk about. We're talking about sports history that is happening on Treaty 7 lands. And activities and education that has been happening on Treaty 7 land for a long time. So it's in that spirit that we are having this talk today. So next slide, please, Andrea. Who are we? Well, as you know, and as Courtney alluded to, I am Marty Clark, and I come from Treaty 1 territory, which is the ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, the OG Cree, Dakota, and the Dene peoples. And it's also homeland of the Métis Nation. I've been at MRU since 2015. Teaching the course that we're going to talk about today since every semester, actually, since 2015, except for this one. And before I pass it on to Andrea to do an introduction, I just wanted to acknowledge something very important. The course that we're going to talk about, the assignment we're going to talk about, and this presentation would be nothing without Andrea's hard work. So Andrea, I want to thank you before I pass it over to you for all the work, amazing work that you do. I'm very, very thankful for it. So thank you very much.
Oh, thanks, Marty. It's such a pleasure to teach with you, for sure. Yeah, so I'm Andrea Phillipson, also a settler scholar. I grew up all along the Great Lakes region, but spent most of my time in Kingston or Gunduragwin in Mohawk. It's the place where you see the confluence of Lake Ontario and the Cataraqui and St. Lawrence rivers. And it's the homeland of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples. And that's where I met Marty, in fact. We did grad school together in a school of kinesiology. And that's how I came to be teaching in health and physical education here at Mount Royal, despite my primary role being in the Academic Development Center. And I love the teaching that we do, and I love this course that we're going to talk about today. So let me give a quick overview of what we're going to talk about today. It's a pretty simple talk. First, we're going to give a background, some relevant background about HPED 1010, this course that we both teach, and particularly the first unit of the course, which is all about the colonial history of sportsing on this land. And that unit features Tom Longboat, so we'll talk a little bit about him. And the unit culminates in an archives assignment. And we have students do that work using the Calgary Stampede souvenir programs, which is, of course, the main topic of our conversation today.
Thank you, Andrea. So, as Andrea mentioned, I don't think I said it, but I should. I'm a settler scholar as well from Treaty 1. And as settler scholars, Andrea and I feel a responsibility to teach about the colonial history of this land. Um, and by this, we mean the ongoing history. And of course, sports and all the ways that people do sports are a major part of that ongoing history. And so when you see the title of this course, HPED 1010, Historical and Philosophical Foundations of Sport and Culture, you might think that this course is about the Western history, the sort of Eurocentric history of sports, from the ancient Greeks to the Romans to the European history, and then over to sort of North America. And you'd be right. In the old version of the course, that's exactly what it was, the one that I inherited here and started teaching in 2015. And while I spent some time changing that course and adding content that was about colonialism, race, racism, these kinds of topics at about the midpoint of the course, this felt like an afterthought to me and certainly to Andrea. When Andrea came on board and started teaching sections of HPED HPED 1010 in 2020. And we together decided to do a major overhaul, starting with a 6-week unit right at the start of the course that centered on the colonial history of sports on this land. And that focused on, as I said, 6 weeks of history of sports on this land, how sports are not merely good or bad, but used as political and social tools, right? So, what we mean when we say political and social tools, we're talking about tools of colonialism and assimilation. And you can think about residential schools and how hockey was played by children in the residential school systems and how that was used to assimilate Indigenous children into mainstream Eurocentric cultural practices. But sports are also tools of Indigenous self-determination, right? So where hockey you can see as a tool of assimilation, also Indigenous peoples have been playing hockey, using it for their own self-determination and playing sports that are meaningful to them and their culture. We also talk about what doing history actually means. What is it? That continual re-engagement with the evidence based in context, getting students to contextualize history, and which allows us to really reevaluate the historical record. And so This unit is a historical journey for students, and we feature one of the most amazing athletes here on Turtle Island ever, an athlete named Tom Longboat. So I'm kind of interested if y'all have heard of Tom Longboat before, because students in 1010 often have never heard this name before, or have maybe heard the name but don't know much about who Tom Longboat was. And Tom Longboat is an Onondagan long distance runner from the Six Nations Reserve, which is located near Brantford, Ontario. Tom Longboat has this incredible sporting history. He won the Boston Marathon by 5 full minutes in his second year of competitive racing. That was in the year 1907. He is hugely famous in his own time, but like I said, most students, and maybe many of you, have never heard of him.
So as Marty said, it's a historical journey that we're asking students to take throughout this course and throughout this first unit. And in the first leg of the historical journey, students learn this sort of basic descriptive history of Tom Longboat, so mostly focused on his sports scene accomplishments. And then they engage some primary sources, so things like newspaper articles about him from the time. And then they note their first impressions of Tom Longboat. And I'm going to share an image of a Jamboard that students completed during a synchronous class session, where they shared their first impressions. And, you know, it includes a lot of positive and negative perceptions of Tom Longboat. Sort of, you know, everything from he was the greatest of all time, a cultural role model, that he was, you know, very successful. They recognize all of this about him. But you can see in the right-hand column of the Jamboard that students echo a lot of the stereotypes that they encounter in those primary sources. So as you might imagine, the newspaper articles are filled with quite disparaging commentary about Tom Longboat and his methods of training. And so students comment on things like he had a lack of discipline, he was obstinate, he was lazy, he was hard to work with, he was naive, these kinds of ideas. Now, some students can see the racism that's evident in these newspaper articles right from the beginning, but others are quite seduced by it, and they really do just, you know, take this on as, well, this must be what Tom Longboat was like then.
Yes. And so what we have here, two pictures, two images for you to look at. On the left is just a snapshot of a 1909 Globe and Mail article that is representative of the kind of media coverage that the media gave Tom Longboat in and around the time that he was running. And that media coverage really sort of presented Longboat as successful yet lazy, even a drunk, and even a failure, despite all of the successes that we talked about. And so we asked students to reflect on how just taking these sources, especially from the time, at face value as proof of what Tom Longboat was like, is problematic. And so we emphasize to them how just looking at those sources, you sort of see that Longboat's own voice is missing from that historical record. It is media coverage of Longboat, and that media coverage is dominated by white male sports writers. Then we ask students to then look at what historians have been doing since in and around the 1980s in reinterpreting Longboat's legacy. So sports historians like Bruce Kidd, and then pictured here, we have Janice Forsyth's award-winning 2020 book, Reclaiming Tom Longboat, which is an incredible book. I do recommend it. It gets my highest recommendation for a sports history book. And we ask students, or we place these sources in the context of colonial racist ideas, or sorry, the historians do that for our students, place these sources in the context of colonialism, racism, and they reinterpret the white media and the management of Tom Longboat and their attempts to assimilate Longboat to the quote unquote right way of doing things, criticizing his training methods because they didn't look like the European norms of the time. All of that despite Longboat's huge successes. So, one of the big points of emphasis here is how these historians sought out new evidence from Longboat's family, Longboat's community, to center the voices that had been actively silenced in the dominant historical record represented by our "'Twas Lucky for Longboat" 1909 Globe and Mail article there. Centering those voices, listening to the people that knew Longboat the best provides a much richer, more complex history.
So then in the next leg of this historical journey, we ask students to reflect now on their second impressions of Tom Longboat. This really is a matter of, for many students, quite a large shift in perception, because once they've come to recognize how the white trainers and managers and media were really trying to assimilate Tom Longboat into these Euro-Canadian ways of doing things, then they're able to see more easily how all of this discourse about Longboat being hard to work with was maybe something else was going on there. And so I'm going to show an image of another Jamboard that students completed about a week after the first one that I showed you. And on the left-hand side, there's, I had reproduced some of their comments from the before, and then asked them on the right-hand side to share their reflections. On a scale of 1 to 10, how changed are your impressions now? And you can see here that students are now calling him an activist, that they recognize his self-knowledge. He knew how to train and how to take care of his body. He was ahead of his time. He was amazing with his own methods. And so they come to see how this problematic, quote unquote, problematic behavior was really Tom Longboat practicing self-determination, that he was really determined to follow the methods that came from his Haudenosaunee traditions, a very long history of long distance running from which he came, and really that he insisted on the value of these traditions, and in celebrating his culture through running, despite all of the criticism that he faced constantly. So, the take-home messages from Unit 1, we really want students to be able to articulate how sports operate in a context of dominant beliefs that justify colonialism, right? Sports aren't magically neutral. They are practiced in a context. They certainly aren't apolitical. And in fact, they are used for social and political ends. So as Marty mentioned before, as tools of both assimilation and Indigenous self-determination. And then there's the, sort of the history pieces, the skill building pieces, I suppose. And this importance of doing continuous history. So that constant rereading of the historical record, recontextualizing, reinterpreting, and being especially mindful of voices that are missing, or, that have been, let's be frank, actively silenced in the historical record and in the evidence that we have. Marty, I think you're muted.
I was muted because someone is doing work on the office right beside me. And so there are noises that are happening. So apologies if you do hear some work being done. And so, as promised, in the title of this talk today, we are going to talk about Stampede and the archives assignment that we ask students to do at the tail end of this unit on colonialism and sport history. And so how do students demonstrate their learning? They do it through a few ways, but one of the main ones is the archives assignment that we will talk about today. One of the first things they do is they go and visit Peter Houston at the MRU Archives and Special Collections. In the online environment, Peter was, nice enough to attend our Google Meet classrooms. And both in the classroom and then in the online environment, he comes prepared with Stampede programs from the 1950s and 1960s. So the assignment, the archives assignment, happens in a few steps that I'm going to talk about here. And that first step is really learning about Peter. Who is Peter? What is an archivist? What are the archives? What's in the MRU Special Collections and Archives? And in particular, what is the Blaine Sports History Collection that Peter and I worked on bringing to MRU? What's in that collection? And the second step is to work with archival material like the program that is pictured here, the Stampede programs. And we get students to think about who created these programs, who's the audience for these programs. And then we ask them to pay particular attention to a few things. Who is represented in the programs? What are the images of the programs? What are the write-ups saying? What is the content of this program? And we ask them to especially pay attention to representations of what are mostly white settler people, and then as well, of course, First Nations peoples. Then we ask them, once they are doing this basic work of looking at sort of who created this program, who is represented, and how are they represented in this program, connect those representations to the course concepts that we talked about already. Get them to think about colonialism and get them to think about voice. Whose voices are coming out through these programs, whose voices are there and represented, and whose are, of course, missing. So we should describe the images here. Andrea, if you want to go back to that. Here we are showing the cover of the 1962 Stampede Souvenir Program, the 50th anniversary. The cover depicts a photo of RCMP officers in formation on horseback in front of a large crowd in the grandstand. And then above that, an illustration of a First Nations man in full regalia, crossing his arms in front of him, shaking hands with both a white male RCMP officer and a white man wearing cowboy clothes. So when we ask students to sort of go through what they notice, they tell us a few different things, and they find a bunch of different both sort of representations in text and in the images. So we see things like white people are portrayed as the Stampede heroes, and Indigenous peoples are there to do things like promote the parade. The way Indigenous people are represented in the program is as if they were added to add flair to the Stampede. However, the traditional clothing that Indigenous people are wearing has meaning. So noticing sort of how they are represented and making some, connections to Indigenous peoples and the meaning that they hold. So First Nations voices are left out. There are about 26 pages about white people and one First Nations people or person. Another thing that a student noticed, there's barely any promotion of First Nations people or their history. Another quote, in this program, you see the perspective of white men. And lastly, out of the examples we brought to you today, white people are shown as participants and organizers. Indigenous people are nameless.
So it's easy to see that the students can, that they recognize assimilation, potential exploitation, lack of respect, lack of understanding in the Stampede programs. But obviously, the interpretation is going to be limited by the material that they have in front of them. And I notice a question just come up in the chat about, well, why didn't you have students look at more material than this? We do, for sure. So we go beyond the archives. Part of Peter's time spent with students is about talking with them about the limitations of history that has been assembled and written from a white settler perspective. He talks about how archives have shifted over the years and how archivists wrestle with their roles and how to sort of juggle preserving archival material while remaining cognizant of exploitative, extractive practices. It's not up to archivists to sort of capture First Nations and Indigenous histories and preserve them in the archives. And so he does talk to them about, some of the newer methods that archivists are practicing in collaboration and in deep consultation with Indigenous communities. So, like in other words, the archives themselves are tools of colonialism. And so we make sure that that students are thinking about how the archives may never be able to do all of the things, right? We need to they're biased and incomplete, and so it's important to think about where else we might look. So in the next stage of this assignment, sort of the fourth thing we ask them to do is, they finish class with Peter, they go home, now they have to do some more homework. And that homework is all about engaging with First Nations perspectives of Stampede. And so there's a couple of things that we had them engage in this past year. So representations of Stampede by Adrian Stimson. And he's a Siksika artist who created a buffalo robe map and history of Stampede. And in the image on the slide is the front cover of like a paper guide, First Nations Stampede guide. And behind me is, inside of that guide is a reproduction of the buffalo robe that Stimson created that I believe is still at Glenbow Museum right now, the actual buffalo robe itself. But I definitely recommend picking up this guide. Each of the images on the map and history have an explanation on the flip side. It's quite rich. And we also have students engage with Karen Nagonagwane's award-winning book Powwow, a celebration through song and dance. And Karen is an Anishinaabe dancer and writer and artist and Mount Royal faculty member. And when the students engage these representations, what we're directing them towards is that these are not stories of like simple flat stories of exploitation and assimilation and being sidelined and being paraded around, right? These are stories of complex and joyous and active and strategic and subversive participation in Stampede and other Wild West shows that Karen talks about in her book. So then there's a fifth stage to this assignment. They come back into class. They get into groups and they talk about one more question collectively, and design a response to it. So the question is this. Over the years, some Indigenous people have claimed that Stampede exploits First Nations peoples, while others have insisted that they participate in a completely voluntary way. And we include a quotation from Wilf Mark from the Stoney Nakoda Nation from 1972, who says, "We do it because we enjoy it." And we ask students to draw on what you've learned in this class about sports being used as tools in this colonial state to explain how these complicated and conflicting interpretations can coexist. So the students talk about assimilation and they talk about Indigenous self-determination and they talk about how one event can have both things happening at the same time. And what we're looking for is a historical journey that takes students beyond those shallow responses that I think would be an initial kind of response here. They might talk about relativism, right? Oh, people's opinions about Stampede differ. That's not what we're looking for, right? We're looking for how sports and sport events are used as tools in very purposeful and particular ways. And this is an image on the slide of Karen's book, Powwow.
Thank you. So, and I definitely can hear a drill in the background, so apologies if you can too. But um, it's important to note here at the end, coming towards the end of our talk, that the students in our classes love sports. I mean, most of them do. And they often come from Treaty 7 territory and the city of Calgary, and they often love Stampede as well. And this course is all about how sports aren't simply good or bad. We teach students to think about sports as being practiced in a context and are used all the time for political ends, economic ends, etc. Sometimes opposite ends at the very same time. And so Stampede has always been both about advancing settler colonial goals, as we talked about, and has been a space for Indigenous self-determination. So Stampede has a complex history, and students are building nuanced analytic skills by having conversations about these collections and moving beyond them. The collections, in this case, the Blaine Sports History Collection, is a material record of a conversation from our own community's past. When we listen to the archive, we hear certain voices and not others. And I know someone is knocking on my door. I'm not going to answer it right now. I don't know what's going on, but thank you very much. So that's the end of our presentation. We ended at just a few minutes early, and hopefully we can address some questions that you have. And I see that there have been a few too in the chat here. And I want to address the first one by Faith, who asks, was there any resistance by students to perceive and discuss sports history as serious history? It's a very, very good question. And my initial reaction is that we get a lot of students in their first year of university in this HPED 1010 class. And I think at that point in their education, they haven't really been exposed to what in history and in upper sort of, graduate level and beyond levels of history is considered serious history. That they are getting their first taste of history through a sports history class. And so we do, I think, a very good job, Andrea, of sort of, telling them that through stories of athletes and through a history of sport, we can learn about the social and cultural historical context in which these sports took place. And so I do think that they get a sense of sort of that the things we're talking about, colonialism, racism, some of these things are quite serious. And so at least I think we do a good job of catching them early and making a pretty strong case that sports are quote unquote serious history. It's a good question.
Yeah, it is. And I want to jump in on that as well. I mean, so early on in the course, as we mentioned, they encountered Janice Forsyth's work. And in that work, Janice talks about that we need to take sports seriously. And in some ways, the students are really ready to do that. Like Marty said, they love sports, right? So it's like, ooh, we get to take it seriously. And, you know, what she talks about in her work is how sports are an education of the body, right? That we actually learn to be and do through our sportsing bodies. And you know, it's a complex um, concept, and so we spend some time digging into that. But what I think is nice about the history course, Marty and I have both taught, and Marty continues to teach sociology of sports. And I did find, you know, back when I was teaching sociology of sports to first year students, that's where I would get resistance, right? They didn't want to talk about gender in sport. They didn't want to talk about sexuality in sport today. But when you start with talking about these ideas in the past, it's a little bit easier for them to wrap their heads around and be okay with, oh, you know, because their initial reaction is, oh, like this is ancient history, right? So it's okay to talk in this very really critical way about sports because this happened 100 years ago or more. But of course, Marty and I, you know, because we're having them practice continuous history, we bring all the threads of all of these concepts forward into a contemporary history as well. But by the time we get there, that's really helped to pave the way, I think, for students to consider how these biases, how these ideas, how these, you know, dominant ways, colonial ways of thinking still exist, even if they look a bit different today. You know, they're still in operation. And so, you know, that's a big piece of the course, is really preparing students to be able to do that work of rethinking to our the water we swim in today, the sportsing water that we swim in.
Yeah, I think it's a good jumping off point to talk about two of the questions that we got in the chat, from one from Allison and one from Wendy, about who are our students and what does their curriculum look like. So um, in the Department of Health and Physical Education here, this is a first year course. And so they are all health and physical education students. It's core to health and phys ed, so it's mostly health and physical education students. We have four majors here: athletic therapy, sport and rec management, ecotourism and outdoor leadership, and physical literacy. So they get this course and its core in their first year. And then um, some of them do have designs to become teachers, physical education teachers, and some do end up taking history courses as minors and as part of their general education curriculum, but mostly they are health and physical, physical education students. So Wendy, to get over to your question, and Wendy asks if there's a second or even third year course offered in our department that continues to build on this particular history and the archival skills. And the other core course that's sort of related is a sociology of sport type course that I also am the course lead for. And so we build on sort of the critical thinking and communication skills that are started in this first year course that we've been talking about today. But it is not a history course. I do not do an archival assignment. I sort of build their critical thinking skills and get them to think about media in contemporary times. So there is some building of the curriculum through, but it's not necessarily history or archival skills that they're necessarily picking back up in that third year course. Great questions, though. Thank you.
And there's a question from Carol, who is designing a course asking students to consider their Eurocentric/colonial view of what science is and why we're dismissive of other ways of knowing. That's awesome to hear about, Carol. And Carol asked, can you please expand on how you encourage this openness to other perspectives? So for example, media portrayals versus athlete voice. And I'll maybe start us off, Marty, but I'll want you to jump in. And maybe I'll foreshadow that we do in the second half of this course, it really is all about dominant scientific ways of thinking about bodies and categorizing humans and how this contributes in sports to like deeply racialized, gendered beliefs and ways of knowing that continue on into today's sports. You know, less blatantly than, you know, the turn of the century, for instance, but, you know, certainly we see those disparities quite clearly and easily. But to get back to your question, Carol, about how we encourage the openness to other perspectives, I guess I would just say, you know, it has to do with that journey that we were talking about in Unit 1, that really, for some students, is very much about creating a disruption in their perceptions. So, you know, like they're going along, they think that they know what this is all about, and then boom, you know, they really, many of them, not all of them, many of them really get hit with this realization that of how limited the dominant historical record really is, of how much history it leaves out. um, and so they want other perspectives at that point, and we use the historians' work, so Bruce Kidd and Janice Forsyth in those early days, to really be able to open their eyes to what doing good historical work would look like, what it does look like to search in other places, listen to other voices. You know, I take a chunk out of Bruce Kidd's article where he actually pulls out evidence that of, you know, a newspaper article from Tom Longboat's time where clearly the message that the writer is trying to convey is that Tom Longboat lazes around all day. But when you actually look at this, you know, timeline of a typical Tom Longboat day, he's like running for a couple of hours. He goes for a 12-mile walk. He plays, you know, rigorous sports for at least an hour each day. Like when you actually look at the evidence that was even in front of the people in the 1900s, you can see how confirmation bias was at work at the time, right? They only saw what they wanted to see in, you know, so when the reporter writes, you know, from 1 until 2 lazes around, these are the words that people honed in on. And the students are, you know, like they're like horrified, they're interested, they're shocked, they're, you know, like they're right in there. They're like, my goodness, I don't walk 12 miles a day. Like this is an athlete's day, right? And they can see it so clearly. So I guess I would just say it really is about that sort of disorienting disruption, if you will, that moment where students recognize what's missing and they want to fill those gaps. Is there anything you would add to that, Marty, or another thing that you think we do?
Well, yeah, it's a great question, and we do ask students to, like later in the semester, we sort of readdress some of these main ideas that we talk about with Tom Longboat, the archives assignment, and you know, for a while I've been doing a lecture on Jack Johnson, who is one of the most famous, or infamous maybe is a better label for Jack Johnson at the time, turn of the century, from the late 1800s into the 1900s. He was a world boxing champion. And through the story of Jack Johnson, I and Andrea reapproach ideas about science, actually, and how at that time the dominant scientific understanding of human beings was that there were different civilizations or races, and that you could sort of understand everything about a person by understanding which quote unquote race they were from. And so Jack Johnson, as a black boxer who fought against white boxers, Canadian named Tommy Burns, another boxer named Jim Jeffries. The media used those dominant scientific, I'm putting heavy air quotes there, about human beings and about evolution. They thought they knew how evolution worked, et cetera, to say that Jack Johnson was just simply going to lose to these white boxers because of, again, heavy air quotes, scientific understandings of what humans were capable of. And so through another story, this time a black boxer named Jack Johnson, we reapproach this and we actually dive deeper into some of the science of evolution, and how science, 100 years ago, in institutions like Mount Royal, was taught from a particular perspective and advanced particular kind of colonial goals again. So then we ask them to think about science and some of the things we think we know about bodies, people today. And then, of course, we reapproach this and talk about gender. We do a week on, or a class on, Catherine Switzer, the first carded runner in the Boston Marathon, and the assumptions that people made about Catherine Switzer and women and what they were capable of in sports like distance running. So yeah, we reapproach that and really dive deeper into the science later in the year. So it's a great question, Carol. Thank you for posing it. Um, and Wendy, I did see your comment there, and I do think that, yeah, there is an opportunity to stay in the archives and also lean on Peter and get Peter in my class to help me. So thanks for that. If there are any other questions, I invite people to put it in the chat, or even unmute yourself, put your hand up, your virtual hand, and ask. We would love that.
Ooh, Carolyn with the Calgary Public Library wants to mention that they have an extensive collection of Stampede memorabilia and especially programs. That's
Thank
awesome.
you, Carolyn. That's awesome. Yeah. Yeah, there was a question at the start too about sort of why we chose these records, these Stampede records only, and not open it up to other archives. And I think one of the reasons why a while ago, sort of Peter and I sort of focused in on the archival records was the archival records that we did about the Stampede, is that the Stampede is very popular in Calgary. It's local. It gives us a chance to actually transition from a talk about Tom Longboat to something on Treaty 7 territory that is meaningful. And the Blaine Sports History Collection has a range of archival materials way beyond the Stampede programs. And I think there's a lot of opportunity in the future to actually open it up and to look at other things. The Blaine collection is really a material record of sport in this part of Western Canada here. And it's rich with programs from not just the Stampede, but sports leagues, several sports leagues that have existed here. So there's plenty of other material to sift through, but it's a big collection. And so we focused in on one that we thought would be really useful and get us to think about something here in our community. But there's much more there.
I mean, Stampede is kind of a big deal.
Kind of, yeah. Yeah.
In these here parts.
Definitely.
I'm just going to jump in for a second. So the Blaine collection, as you were saying, Marty, is massive and was actually the jumping off point for the entire collections and conversations programming. So for those of you who don't know, I know we have folks joining us from all over Canada. Collections and Conversations is both a series of speaker talks, which we've been hosting online this year, and it's also a physical exhibit. So we took a number of items from that Blaine sports collection, as well as a couple other things from the archives and a few things from our main collection. And we have them featured on big poster boards as a way to have people consider these items and how they can view them in different contexts, and how those items can be used as another jumping off point for projects and research and assignments. These talks have spanned a number of topics and a number of ways that you can go with things. So if you have a chance and you're in Calgary, I highly recommend dropping by the library and coming up to the 4th floor, and you can take a look at some of those items on the posters. And then if you want to dive in a little deeper, you can probably make an appointment with Peter in the archives.
I was also thinking, Marty, is it okay if I share our email addresses in the chat? If anyone wanted to talk with us any further about this particular course and course design and how we've worked with an archivist, I think we'd both be happy to chat more.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, perfect.
I'll put mine in, Andrea, and you can.
Oh, okay. I was just typing it, but I'm not 100% sure. Yeah. See, I was thinking, is it 1 or 2? I can never remember what the number is appended to your name there.
Yeah, mclark2 at mountroyal.ca. I think too, Peter Houston does know this. Our assignment, of course, he's in the classroom with us, delivering the archives assignment. So great person to talk to as well about building assignments in a class like ours. I know he's working on other assignments too in other classes, especially history classes. But not just limited to history classes. So he's got a lot of experience doing things like this as well.
Yeah, for sure. I think we can't say enough nice things about Peter. It's been fantastic working with him for sure.
Yeah, it really has. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Christy.
Yeah, thanks to everyone and their comments and questions in the chat. It's really appreciated. And I'll just reiterate something Andrea just said. We're happy to talk about this moving forward. And if you have questions about anything or ideas for us, we're also very receptive to having that conversation.
Yeah, totally. We're open to all the constructive criticism you might have, for sure. There are ways certainly in which we could, are not doing this work well enough. Absolutely. And so it is a constant, I don't know, reinterpretation of our own practices, in fact, that informs our course design. Thanks.
I actually have a question.
Oh, sure.
When you were putting this course together, was there any consultation with Indigenous peoples here? Did you work with anybody specifically on sort of, their viewpoint on how the material was being approached?
Yes and no. So I had an opportunity, I don't know what year it is now, 2017, to do a faculty learning community at Mount Royal with a bunch of other settler scholars, and we got to build relationships with First Nations from Treaty 7. So we worked with the Stoney Nakoda and as well as Siksika. And so we got to talk about a lot of these things, and I had an opportunity through that faculty learning community to talk about this course as well as my 3rd year course. But I mean, I definitely want to do more of that, right? And so Andrea and I, as well as actually Peter, have talked about one of the next main steps that we need to do is talk with First Nations elders from the community, especially the part about voices, right? And asking both for consultation, but to come talk to our students, because I think that part is really, really important.
And I will say, yeah, great question. In introducing Adrian Stimpson and Karen Nagonagwane's work, that's with permission from both of those artists. And so, some consultation in there about like, this is what this would be used for, and in this way. So yeah, so some, but like, again, constant need to continue and to continue to do this work in a good way and in a better way.
Thank you.
Thanks for that.
Yeah, of course. I don't see any more questions popping up in the chat right now, so I just want to take this opportunity to thank you both, Marty and Andrea. This has been an absolute pleasure. I've really enjoyed hosting these sessions throughout the semester, and today is no exception to that. So thank you for being here, for sharing your time, your expertise, and really being open to sort of whatever the crowd has thrown at you here. Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting us, Courtney.
Yeah, thanks so much, Courtney.
Of course.
Thanks to everyone for being here.